Graham Whitmore sat behind his massive mahogany desk, flipping through a series of credit card statements that read more like the quarterly earnings report of a mid-sized corporation. Cala's spending was outrageous, even by his standards. $10,000 on a limited edition purse. $12,000 on a week at some private resort in Bali. More luxury baby gear than a single infant could possibly use. She wasn't just preparing for motherhood, she was curating an aesthetic. He set the papers down and exhaled through his nose, willing himself not to slam his fist on the desk. His assistant, a woman so efficient she made Swiss watches look lazy, had left a neatly typed note on top of the folder. Cala's spending has increased 42% this quarter. Thought you should see. He had seen. And now, he had decided. Cala breezed into his office as if summoned by the sheer force of his irritation. She was radiant, dressed in something effortlessly expensive, her hair styled in soft waves that suggested she had woken up like this when in fact, a team of professionals had probably been involved. She paused, taking in his expression with an amused smirk. You look like you just found out your hotel's been turned into a chain of roadside motels. Graham folded his hands over the folder. Sit down, Cala. She sighed dramatically, lowering herself onto the plush leather chair across from him, her belly a perfect curve under the silk of her designer dress. If this is about the stroller, I swear, it's not just a stroller. It's an investment. It adjusts as the baby grows, it has an eco-friendly frame. This is about your entire life, not a stroller, he cut in. You don't have a job, you don't have a plan, and the father of this child is nowhere to be found. Her smile faltered. Kieran isn't. Kieran is gone. He said it flatly, without emotion. He posted a photo from Mykonos last week. A yacht full of women, Cala. I don't think he was worrying about your nursery paint colors. Cala's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She wouldn't. She knew Kieran had checked out. Graham had raised her to be many things, impulsive, spoiled, reckless, but not stupid. I'll figure it out, she said finally. I always do. He leaned forward, voice lowering. No, Cala. You won't. You never have. You're playing house with an unborn child, thinking you can order responsibility the way you order handbags. But babies don't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. You need to learn that. She rolled her eyes. Let me guess. This is the part where you take away my credit cards and make me live off instant ramen in some shoebox apartment? His lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. No. This is the part where you get married. She laughed. Excuse me? You heard me. I'm sorry, I thought you just suggested marriage as if it were a spa treatment I needed to try. She sat up straighter, expression incredulous. You can't be serious. I am. Completely. He reached into a different folder, pulling out a single sheet of paper. I've arranged a marriage for you. The wedding is in 2 days. Her brain seemed to short-circuit for a moment. What, who, what the hell are you talking about? Evander Calloway. She stared at him, waiting for a punchline that never came. Who the hell is Evander Calloway? He owns Calloway Woodworks. He builds custom furniture for my hotels. Cala squinted as if she were trying to recall if she had ever encountered such a person. So what, you're marrying me off to a carpenter? Not a carpenter. A businessman. A very talented one. He leaned back, satisfied by the horrified expression on her face. He's also drowning in debt. His workshop is on the verge of shutting down. He needs help, and I need my daughter to learn how to be an adult. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. That's insane. You're insane. I'm not marrying some random guy because you don't think I can handle being a mother. You don't have a choice. She snapped her mouth shut as realization hit. He had cut her off. No cards, no cash, no safety net. This was a power move. You think you can just force me into this? What is this, the 18th century? You are legally an adult, Calla. You can walk away. But if you do, you walk away from everything. Her blood ran cold. You wouldn't. He held her gaze. Try me. Across town, Van Calloway stood in his workshop, staring at the contract Graham had placed in front of him as if it might burst into flames. He ran a hand through his hair, fingers catching on the splinters from a project he had abandoned mid-sanding. He should have known Graham Whitmore wouldn't just offer him a lifeline out of generosity. A man like that didn't make deals, he owned people. Van had spent weeks trying to figure out how to salvage his business after a partnership with a fraudulent supplier had left him deep in a financial hole. He had taken out loans. He had stretched his staff as thin as he could without breaking them. He had fought. But the numbers didn't lie. He was running out of time. Graham's offer was simple. Marry his daughter, and in return, all debts erased. A lucrative, long-term contract supplying custom pieces for Whitmore hotels. Financial stability for the first time in years. All he had to do was marry some rich girl he had never met. The absurdity of it made him laugh, but it was hollow. He wanted to say no. He should say no. But the alternative was losing everything. He had spent years building something out of nothing. He couldn't let it slip through his fingers because of his own pride. Still, the idea of being tied to someone like Callista Whitmore, a woman he knew only from tabloids and staged social media posts, made him physically uncomfortable. He had no illusions about what she would be like: spoiled, shallow, impossible. Graham had assured him there were no expectations beyond the wedding itself. No need for love, affection, or even companionship. Just a contractual agreement. But Van knew better. There were always expectations. Even unspoken ones. He took a deep breath and grabbed the pen. His name scrawled across the bottom of the contract, stark and final. What the hell had he just done? Calla had always assumed that if she ever got married, it would be in some opulent setting, a vineyard in Napa, a chateau in France, or maybe a rooftop garden in the middle of Manhattan. There would be champagne, a live orchestra, and a dress that took 6 months to design. Instead, she was standing in the dull, fluorescent-lit hallway of a municipal courthouse, staring at a vending machine that offered stale honey buns and lukewarm coffee. Her father sat on a bench across from her, scrolling through his phone, utterly unbothered by the fact that he was forcing his only daughter into marriage. Calla had tried everything, yelling, pleading, demanding, but Graham had anticipated all of it. Her phone was useless, her accounts were locked, and her so-called friends had ghosted her the moment they realized she wasn't footing the bill anymore. Kieran was off in Ibiza or Tulum or some other place where men with an allergy to responsibility congregated, probably unaware that she was on the verge of being legally tethered to a complete stranger. A clerk appeared and waved them inside. The room was small, beige, and smelled vaguely of floor polish and bureaucratic indifference. Van was already there, standing by a desk, looking exactly as thrilled about this as she was. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built like someone who spent his days moving heavy things. His hands were in his pockets, his face unreadable. The only thing that gave away any sort of emotion was the way his jaw flexed every few seconds, as if he were grinding his teeth into dust. The officiant, an exhausted-looking woman in a brown blazer, flipped through a stack of papers and gave them a tight, impatient smile. "Shall we begin?" Calla turned to her father. "I hope you know I'm never speaking to you again after this." "Noted," Graham said, not looking up from his phone. The officiant cleared her throat and launched into the legal jargon that would bind Calla and Van together in a way neither of them had asked for. Calla tried to focus on the absurdity of it all, but there was a growing pressure in her back, a deep, pulsing ache that had started earlier that morning. She had chalked it up to stress, but now it felt sharper, more insistent. Van remained silent, nodding when required, his voice steady but detached when he was forced to respond. When it was her turn, Calla barely choked out the words. It wasn't that she thought saying, "I do," would actually doom her, it was just the principle of it. Then came the rings. Graham, always efficient, had already handled it. A plain gold band was placed in Van's palm, and a matching one was slipped onto Calla's finger, the weight of it sending a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant announced, though even she sounded like she doubted it would happen. Van made no move to close the distance between them, and Calla could have kissed him out of sheer gratitude for that alone. Instead, they stood there, two strangers legally shackled to one another, while Graham checked his watch. The officiant signed the document and slid it across the desk. "That's it. You're married." Something inside Calla twisted. A sharp, searing pain shot through her lower abdomen, stealing her breath. She pressed a hand to her stomach, swallowing a gasp. The pressure she'd been ignoring all morning suddenly wasn't ignorable anymore. Van frowned. "You okay?" "No," she said, voice thin. I think something's wrong." A rush of warmth spread down her legs, a horrifying realization settling in at the same time as Graham stood up from his chair. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," she muttered. Van looked down. His eyes widened slightly. "Is that? My water just broke." The clerk, still hovering near the doorway, made a noise that sounded dangerously close to a scream. The officiant bolted upright, knocking over a stapler. Graham exhaled through his nose like a man who had dealt with far too much nonsense in his lifetime and was utterly unimpressed by the addition of childbirth to his afternoon schedule. Calla braced against the desk as another contraction tore through her, her fingernails digging into the wood. Van was suddenly there, his hands hovering near her elbow, unsure if he was allowed to help. "Someone call a doctor," Graham ordered, though he didn't sound remotely concerned. The clerk already had her phone out, voice shrill as she spoke to a dispatcher. Calla clenched her jaw. This cannot be happening here. Van, her brand new husband, who just that morning had been a stranger to her, tilted his head and considered her, eyes calm despite the chaos around them. "Yeah," he said dryly. "I don't think you get a say in that." The ride to the hospital was an exercise in chaos. Calla was barely aware of anything beyond the stabbing contractions that stole her breath, but she caught flashes, the panicked courthouse clerk attempting to be helpful but mostly getting in the way, Van gripping the steering wheel like he was willing the car forward by sheer force, and her father in the back seat, unbothered, scrolling through emails as if this were just another business meeting running off schedule. "Can you drive any faster?" she hissed through clenched teeth. Van didn't even glance at her. "We're going 90 in a 50, so unless you want me to deliver this baby on the side of the road, I'd suggest you breathe through it." She groaned, leaning her head back against the seat. "I swear if I die in this car." "You won't," Van muttered. Her father sighed. "No one is dying. Stop being dramatic." Calla twisted around, glaring at him despite the pain. "I'm about to push a human being out of my body in a dress I didn't even get to pick for my forced wedding. Let me be dramatic." The car swerved slightly as Van took the exit toward the hospital. "Let's save the arguments for when you're not in labor." The next few minutes blurred together. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, barking orders at the staff. Graham disappeared the moment they entered the maternity ward, likely off to find the nearest overpriced coffee. Van, shockingly, didn't leave. He trailed behind as they rushed her into a room, expression unreadable, hands shoved in his pockets like he was waiting for someone to hand him a refund policy on this whole situation. A contraction hit and Calla doubled over, gripping the side of the hospital bed. A nurse with sharp eyes and an air of competence tightened a monitor around her belly. "You're fully dilated. This baby's coming now." Calla's head snapped up. "No epidural? No time." Panic clawed at her chest. "But I'm not ready." The nurse gave her a look that made it clear that readiness was not required. The next 20 minutes were a mess of searing pain, shouted instructions, and an overwhelming sense that her body was not built for this despite very clear evidence to the contrary. At some point, her father reappeared, standing near the door, arms crossed like he was assessing an underperforming employee. He didn't say a word. Van, still unreadable, remained near the side of the room, closer than Graham but not quite involved. Calla wasn't sure if she wanted him closer or further away, only that she wanted this to be over. The doctor gave her a firm nod. One more push. Calla squeezed her eyes shut and did what she was told. Then suddenly, a cry. Sharp, piercing, real. The panic she'd felt only moments ago evaporated in an instant. A small, wriggling body was placed against her chest, and Calla's world shrank down to the tiny face peeking up at her, blinking through the harsh lights. "Meet your daughter," the nurse murmured. Calla sucked in a breath, staring at the impossibly perfect baby in her arms. Oriana. Ori. Her tiny fingers curled against Calla's skin, and everything else, the courthouse, the forced marriage, the uncertainty, fell away. She'd thought this was just another way to rebel. A statement against her father, proof that she didn't need his control. But looking down at Ori, she realized she hadn't just been fighting against him. She'd been fighting against herself. The version of her that wasn't ready to grow up. The version that still thought everything in life could be charmed away. There was no charm in this moment, only undeniable, breathtaking reality. Ori was hers. And she was Ori's. Her father was still standing at the doorway. She looked up, expecting, what? A softening? A flicker of warmth? He gave her a long, measured look. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Something inside her cracked, but she didn't let it show. The room quieted. The doctor murmured something about stitches. The nurses busied themselves with checking Ori's vitals. Graham was gone, and now, only Van remained. Calla expected him to make his exit too, to mutter something about letting her rest and slip out of the room. Instead, he shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "You good?" She let out a short, exhausted laugh. "I just gave birth. So no." Van didn't smile, but something in his posture eased. His eyes flicked to Ori. "She okay?" Calla looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms. "Yeah. She's okay." Van nodded. He still wasn't moving, wasn't leaving. "You don't have to stay," she said, though there wasn't much force behind it. He shrugged. "I don't have to, but I'm here." She frowned. "Why?" He exhaled through his nose, looking at Ori again, quieter this time. "She didn't ask for any of this either." Calla blinked, something unexpected twisting in her chest. She had assumed his presence was about duty, fulfilling whatever obligation Graham had tied to this mess. But this wasn't that. This was something else. Van wasn't staying because of her. He was staying because of Ori. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Calla didn't feel entirely alone. The loft smelled like sawdust, varnish, and something else, failure. Or at least, that's what it felt like to Calla as she stood in the middle of the space, clutching Ori against her chest and staring at the disaster that was now her home. The entire place was one open room, with exposed brick walls and windows so streaked with dust they barely let in any light. The furniture, what little there was, had a sturdy but unfinished look, like everything had been half-built and then abandoned. "This is a joke, right?" she asked, shifting Ori higher on her shoulder. "You're actually telling me we live here?" Van didn't look up from where he was unloading a crate near his workbench. "It's not, we. You live here. I work here." She turned, ready to snap at him, but her body betrayed her. A sharp, raw ache shot through her abdomen, and she sucked in a breath. She had barely sat down since giving birth, and it felt like her entire body was held together with sheer resentment and surgical stitches. There was no king-sized bed, no silk sheets, no staff to bring her anything. Just a mattress shoved against the wall, a sink that barely qualified as a kitchen, and a rickety crib that looked like it belonged in a haunted house. Ori let out a soft cry, wiggling against Callah's chest. Van finally glanced over, taking in the way she winced when she moved, the exhaustion in her face. For a second, she thought he might say something, but then he just grabbed a hammer and turned back to whatever life-sized furniture emergency he was dealing with. Callah exhaled sharply, moving toward the crib. "This looks like something a baby from the 1800s would die in," she muttered. Van didn't even pretend to be insulted. "Built it last night." "Are you serious? You needed one." She stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he was already back to acting like she didn't exist. Ori fussed again, and Callah realized she had no idea what she was supposed to be doing. She had planned for a very different version of motherhood, one where she had help, had a nanny, had sleep. Now, she was standing in a workshop that doubled as a construction site, exhausted, in pain, and absolutely out of her depth. She hadn't even figured out bottles yet. She fumbled through the bag of baby supplies her father's assistant had packed for her. Everything was too fancy and too complicated. Where was the normal stuff? She stared at a bottle warmer with digital settings that looked like something out of a spaceship. Ori cried louder. Okay, I got it," Callah mumbled, frantically pressing buttons. The warmer made a sound she did not trust. She yanked the bottle out and nearly dropped it. "Too hot. Way too hot." She groaned, shifting from foot to foot. What kind of idiot makes a bottle warmer that boils milk? This is a conspiracy against mothers. I bet men designed this. Van, miraculously, did not engage in the argument she was having with the bottle warmer. Ori's cries grew more frantic. Callah tried blowing on the bottle, then running it under questionable tap water, but Ori was getting angrier by the second. Callah's vision blurred. Her chest tightened. She wasn't used to failing at things, not like this. A chair scraped against the floor. Callah barely registered Van moving until he was standing next to her, reaching for the bottle. "Give it to me," he said, holding out a hand. She almost didn't. She wanted to prove she could do this. But her hands were shaking, Ori was screaming, and everything inside her felt raw and unsteady. She shoved the bottle into his hand. Van took it without a word, turned, and filled a bowl with cool water from the sink. He placed the bottle inside, swishing it slowly. Ori's cries pierced the loft, and Callah's shoulders curled inward. "She's fine," Van said. "Give it a minute." Callah wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, surprised to find it wet. "Why are you helping?" Van didn't look up. "She's hungry." "So?" He gave her a look, one that made it clear she was missing something obvious. Then he reached for the bottle, tested it against his wrist, and handed it to her. "Now it's fine," he said. She hesitated before taking it. The bottle was warm, but not burning. Van didn't linger. He moved back toward his workbench as if nothing had happened. Callah sat on the mattress that could barely be called a bed, cradling Ori as she latched onto the bottle. Her daughter calmed instantly, her tiny fingers curling against Callah's wrist. The tears she had been holding back all day threatened to spill over again, but this time, they weren't just from frustration. Van had helped. Not because he had to. Not because anyone was watching. But because he could. Callah hadn't slept in 3 days. Or maybe 4. Time had become a blur of crying, feeding, burping, diaper changing, and attempting to decode the mysterious whims of a newborn who seemed personally offended by the concept of sleep. She had been many things in life, rebellious, indulgent, wildly impractical, but never this level of exhausted. Her bones ached, Her skin felt permanently sticky with baby spit up, and the dark circles under her eyes were so pronounced that she had actually startled herself in the mirror that morning. Ori, oblivious to her mother's slow descent into madness, let out a sharp wail from the crib, making Calla flinch. "She's doing it on purpose," she muttered, rubbing her face. "She knows I'm weak." Across the room, Van was completely unbothered as he worked on something at his cluttered workbench. He had an almost annoying ability to tune out the chaos, hammering away while Ori screamed and Calla spiraled into sleep-deprived hysteria. She groaned, stretching her arms overhead and ignoring the sharp ache in her lower back. "I swear, if I don't sleep soon, I'm going to start hallucinating." Van didn't look up. "Sounds like a you problem." Calla turned, glaring daggers at the back of his head. "Wow, what an incredibly helpful response." He set down his hammer and reached for something on the shelf. "What do you expect me to do? Hold your hand? Pat you on the back and say you're doing amazing, sweetie?" "Yes," she snapped. "That would be the decent human thing to do." Van finally turned, expression unreadable, before walking over and dropping something heavy in her lap. "A screwdriver." She blinked. "What am I supposed to do with this? Stab you?" "The chair's broken," he said, gesturing toward a wooden chair in the corner. "Fix it." Calla looked between him, the chair, and the screwdriver like he had just suggested she perform open-heart surgery with a butter knife. "What? You want to complain? Fine. But you can do it while working." She let out a sharp laugh, waiting for him to admit this was a joke. He didn't. "You're out of your mind," she said. "You live here now. You should learn to fix things." "I don't even know how." "Then learn." She stared at him, mouth open, fully speechless. Of all the things she had expected from this arrangement, being assigned manual labor as a coping mechanism had not been one of them. "Unbelievable," she muttered, dragging herself up from the mattress and shuffling toward the chair. Van didn't offer any instructions. He just watched her struggle, arms crossed, as she squatted down and examined the legs like a person who had never encountered furniture before. She poked at the loose leg with the screwdriver, willing it to fix itself through sheer annoyance. When nothing happened, she huffed and started twisting random screws, fully expecting to make it worse. Within 5 minutes, she had somehow detached 2 legs and was dangerously close to giving up on life entirely. She turned her most pathetic expression toward Van. "You could just help me, you know. You could stop expecting people to do everything for you." She groaned, dropping onto the floor dramatically. "You are so annoying." He smirked. "I get that a lot." Calla hated how satisfying it probably was for him to watch her struggle. This was exactly what he wanted, to prove that she was helpless, that she wasn't built for this life. Well, screw that. She tightened her grip on the screwdriver and forced herself back up, jaw clenched. If fixing this chair was the thing standing between her and Van's smug superiority, then she was going to fix this stupid chair. It took hours. She twisted and untwisted the same screws 4 different times, accidentally hammered her own thumb, and nearly quit no less than 6 times. But eventually, somehow, the chair was upright again. Was it slightly crooked? Yes. Did she feel like a broken woman? Also yes. But she had done it. She turned to Van, expecting at least a nod of approval. Instead, he walked over, pushed down on the seat slightly, and watched as it collapsed immediately. Calla let out a strangled scream, hurling the screwdriver across the room. Van choked on a laugh, barely smothering it behind his fist. "Unbelievable," she muttered, stomping toward the crib. "I'm done. I'm going to sleep. If Ori cries, it's your problem." Van didn't argue. She collapsed onto the mattress, too tired to even care that she was covered in sawdust. Sometime in the night, she woke to Ori's soft fussing, but before she could sit up, she heard movement across the room. Van, moving silently, lifting Ori with practiced ease, rocking her gently. Calla, too tired to process whatever that meant, let herself drift back to sleep. When Van turned, expecting her to be awake and complaining, he saw her curled up on the floor beside the crib, one hand tucked under her cheek. She could have slept in the bed, but she had chosen to be near Ori instead. Van, despite himself, felt something shift. She hadn't run away. Calla was on her third cup of coffee and her second attempt at changing Ori's onesie when a knock echoed through the workshop. The baby squirmed on the makeshift changing table, really just a wooden workbench Van had cleared off, while Calla wrestled with the world's tiniest, most uncooperative set of sleeves. Hold on, she muttered, trying to work one of Ori's arms through the fabric. Another knock, louder this time. Van. Can you get that? Silence. She exhaled sharply, shifting Ori onto her hip as she stomped toward the door. She yanked it open, already annoyed, only to lose all ability to breathe. Kieran stood there, leaning against the doorframe like he was posing for a magazine shoot, sunglasses perched on his perfectly styled hair, a smirk so familiar and so infuriating on his face. Hey, babe, he said, voice as smooth as ever. Calla nearly slammed the door in his face out of pure instinct. She recovered quickly, adjusting Ori against her shoulder. What the hell are you doing here? Kieran ignored the hostility entirely, his gaze sweeping over her, over the workshop, taking in every detail with a polished kind of arrogance. Just came to see my girls. Calla actually laughed. Oh, really? Your girls? Is that what we are? Kieran sighed dramatically, slipping off his sunglasses. Come on, Calla. Don't be like that. I know I screwed up, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. I want to be in Ori's life. I want to be a family. The audacity. She shifted her weight, glancing back over her shoulder, expecting to see Van somewhere in the background. Nothing. Of course. He probably heard Kieran's voice and decided this was her mess to handle. She turned back, narrowing her eyes. Let me guess. This sudden burst of fatherly devotion wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that my dad officially announced Ori's birth in that big magazine spread last week, would it? Kieran had the nerve to look offended. What? No. I don't care about that stuff. I just... Save it. She adjusted Ori again, noticing how he still hadn't even looked at her properly. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, the same rehearsed gesture he always used when trying to seem sincere. Look, I know I was a little freaked out when you got pregnant. Calla scoffed. Freaked out? You were posting photos from Ibiza with 3 models 3 days after I told you. He lifted his hands in mock surrender. I needed time to process. Calla was so done. She stepped back, half a mind to slam the door in his face, but before she could, Kieran's eyes finally landed on Ori. He hesitated, tilting his head slightly. Wow. So that's her, huh? Ori let out a tiny squeak, her big eyes blinking up at him. Kieran took a step forward. Can I hold her? Something inside Calla instantly rebelled. Kieran had never held a baby in his life. The idea of him, this man, this absolute joke of a person, holding Ori made her skin crawl. But she also knew Kieran, and if she told him no outright, he would act like she was the unreasonable one. So instead, she exhaled, plastered on a neutral expression, and held Ori out slightly. Go ahead. Kieran visibly hesitated. His arms moved in some half-hearted, clueless attempt at creating a cradle, and Calla could tell immediately that he had no idea what he was doing. Okay, wait, he said, already panicking. How do I just? Calla rolled her eyes. You hold her like a baby, Kieran. He awkwardly scooped Ori up, his entire posture rigid. Ori squirmed, sensing the discomfort, and within seconds, she let out a frustrated cry. She hates me, Kieran said, shifting uncomfortably. Calla crossed her arms. Maybe because you're holding her like she's a bag of groceries. Kieran immediately looked around, like he was searching for a way out. He had never handled discomfort well, not in relationships, not in life, and clearly not with babies. Ori wailed louder, and Kieran's face lit up with full-blown panic. Okay, take her back. Calla didn't move. You sure? I mean, you came all this way to be a devoted father. You can't even last a minute? He gritted his teeth. Calla. Take the baby. She plucked Ori from his arms, smirking as she instantly settled against her shoulder. Kieran exhaled like he had just escaped a hostage situation. She bounced Ori gently, letting the moment settle between them. Here's the thing, she said, keeping her voice light, almost bored. You don't want to be a dad, Kieran. You never did. And that's fine, really. Ori doesn't need a dad who's only here because it looks good on a magazine cover. Kieran scoffed. You think I care about a magazine cover? Calla smiled. I know you do. Kieran opened his mouth to argue, but then, right on cue, Van's voice came from across the workshop. Are we done here? Calla turned just in time to see Van leaning against his workbench, arms crossed, watching the whole thing with mild amusement. Kieran tensed, immediately shifting into arrogant territory. Oh, what, you're playing house now? Van tilted his head slightly, the barest hint of a smirk playing at his lips. Not playing. Kieran scoffed. Whatever. You two can have your weird little forced marriage or whatever this is. I was just trying to do the right thing. Calla snorted. Yeah? Well, consider it done. Now leave. Kieran's jaw tightened, but there was nothing left to say. He threw his sunglasses back on, turned, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Van pushed off the workbench, strolling toward her. So. That went well. Calla let out a breath, still bouncing Ori. I hate that I ever dated him. Van smirked. Yeah. That makes two of us. Calla wasn't sure when boredom became worse than exhaustion, but at some point between Ori's morning nap and Van's relentless hammering, it happened. Her entire life, she had never been this still. Even in her worst hangovers, even when her father had grounded her for some mildly extravagant rebellion, she had always had distractions. Shopping, parties, endless scrolling through other people's curated versions of their lives. Now, she had nothing. Ori was asleep in the crib Van had built, a functional, sturdy thing, though Calla still thought it looked like it belonged in an old-timey horror movie. Van was working on something across the room, completely content to ignore her existence, which was a different kind of insult entirely. She stood, stretching dramatically. Do you ever take breaks, or are you one of those machines disguised as a person? Van didn't look up. You get used to it. She made a face. That's depressing. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. That's work. She rolled her eyes and drifted closer to his workbench, eyeing the scattered sketches and wood samples. So what's this one? She asked, picking up a drawing. Van plucked it from her hands immediately. Custom shelving for a hotel in Aspen. She narrowed her eyes. Did you just snatch that out of my hands like I'm a toddler? You gonna help, or are you just here to complain? She scoffed. Help with what? Sanding? I'm not sanding. Van smirked, fully expecting her to quit the conversation there. And normally? She would have. But she was bored out of her mind, and if her options were staring at the wall or proving Van wrong, she was going to prove Van wrong. She grabbed a piece of scrap wood and a pencil, sitting at the workbench across from him. Fine, she said. I'll design something. He raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Yeah. Van clearly didn't believe her, but he shrugged and went back to his work. She tapped the pencil against the wood, thinking. Ori's crib. She hated it. It was fine, but it wasn't hers. It was something Van had built out of necessity, not something Calla had picked or planned for her daughter. She ignored Van entirely, sketching out an idea. She wasn't completely useless. She knew enough about design to have opinions, even if her dad had paid someone to do the actual decorating in her apartments. It took a while. She erased, redrew, frowned at how stupid the legs looked, changed them, fixed the curve of the frame. She wasn't even sure how much time had passed when Van's voice cut through the silence. "What's that?" She snapped the wood against her chest like a middle schooler caught passing notes. "Nothing," she said quickly. Van squinted. "You look suspicious." "Because I don't trust you," she shot back. "You're going to be a condescending ass about it." Van sighed dramatically. "Calla, show me the sketch." She exhaled through her nose, hesitating, then flipped the wood over, pushing it across the table. Van picked it up, examining it without saying anything. She watched him closely, ready to defend every artistic choice she made. When he finally spoke, it was not what she expected. "This is actually good." She blinked. "What?" He nodded at the drawing. "The curve on the headboard. The way the legs slope so it's more balanced. It's good." Calla narrowed her eyes, waiting for the sarcasm. But there wasn't any. She crossed her arms. "You don't have to humor me. I know I'm not a real designer or whatever." Van shook his head, still studying the sketch. "I'm serious. This would look good built out." Her stomach did something weird, something warm and unfamiliar. She shrugged, trying to play it off. "I mean, I just thought, Ori's crib is fine and all, but it's kinda old-fashioned. No offense. I wanted something that felt like her." Van did something else unexpected. He smiled. Not a smirk. Not an annoying, knowing grin. A real smile. "Let's build it," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "You designed it," he said, standing up and reaching for supplies. "Now let's build it." She was too shocked to argue. And that was how, for the first time in her entire life, Calla Whitmore picked up a drill and built something real. The dress was ridiculous. Layers of silk, stitched within an inch of its life, cinched so tight around her waist that Calla could barely breathe, let alone move. The heels were worse, designed by a man who had never walked a day in his life, and the jewelry, loaned from one of her father's endless connections, felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. Graham's charity gala was one of those events where the wealthiest people on the planet pretended they cared about struggling communities while drinking champagne that cost more than the monthly rent of those same communities. Calla had been attending since she was old enough to sip sparkling water out of a flute and make polite conversation with people she secretly despised. And yet, as she stepped out of the car onto the red carpet, everything felt different. The flashing cameras, the careful smiles, the insincere compliments. It used to be her world, but now it felt distant, artificial. "Smile," Graham muttered as they walked toward the entrance. Calla forced a brittle, camera-ready expression onto her face, her cheeks already aching. Van, standing beside her in a stupidly well-fitted suit, did not smile. He didn't even look remotely interested in playing along. His hands were in his pockets, his stance relaxed in a way that bordered on insubordination, and Calla was almost impressed by how thoroughly uninterested he was in impressing anyone. Inside, the ballroom was all glass and gold, chandeliers hanging like dripping diamonds from the ceiling. Servers in crisp white jackets moved effortlessly between tables, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres that no one actually ate. Calla had spent years knowing exactly what to say, exactly how to move through these crowds, but tonight, her dress itched, her stomach was tight, and she desperately wished she was anywhere else. She spotted the usual suspects, her father's business associates, a few of her former friends, a handful of socialites she used to vacation with but never actually liked. Calla. She barely had time to brace herself before Vivian Rothwell appeared at her side, holding a martini and a smile so sharp it could slice through marble. God, it's been forever, Vivian said, tilting her head. I barely recognized you. Motherhood has made you so earthy. Calla clenched her jaw. Nice to see you too, Viv. Vivian's gaze drifted. And this must be your husband? Van, who had clearly been ready to ignore everything, grunted a greeting and extended his hand. Vivian let out a laugh so fake it deserved an award. Oh, I don't shake hands. Germs, you know. Van lowered his hand, entirely unfazed. Right. Wouldn't want to risk that. Calla smothered a laugh. Vivian's expression barely faltered. So, tell me, Calla, what's it like being poor? Calla's spine went rigid. Vivian smiled, sweet and venomous. I mean, no offense, darling, but going from penthouses to whatever you're doing now. It must be humbling. Calla opened her mouth, ready to say something terrible and not at all polite, but before she could, Van stepped forward. She's not poor, he said, voice steady, casual, but sharp as steel. Vivian raised an eyebrow. Oh. I must have misunderstood. I thought Graham cut her off. Van shrugged. Maybe. But Calla's the kind of person who could start with nothing and still build something better than all of this. Silence. Calla stared at him, heartbeat off kilter. Vivian let out a tight, humorless laugh. Well. That's adorable. Van tilted his head, considering her. And what do you do, Vivian? Vivian blinked. Excuse me? He gestured around. You clearly have strong opinions about who has value in this room. Just wondering what you bring to the table. Besides, well. The table. Vivian's face did something priceless. Calla choked on a laugh, biting the inside of her cheek to keep it together. Vivian scoffed, tossing her hair over one shoulder. Enjoy your night, Calla. She stalked away, her ridiculous silk train nearly taking out a waiter in the process. Calla turned to Van, still half in shock, half in admiration. You didn't have to do that, she said. Van shrugged. I don't like bullies. Calla, for the first time in a long time, didn't have anything clever to say. Because Van wasn't just tolerating this stupid event or enduring her old life. He was standing beside her. The bad news arrived at exactly the wrong time. Van was in the middle of cutting a slab of oak for a custom table when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He ignored it at first, but then it buzzed again. And again. And when Van finally wiped his hands on his jeans and grabbed the phone, he saw a string of texts from his supplier, all variations of the same thing. Bad news. Call me ASAP. Sorry, man. The hotel pulled out. Van stared at the words, willing them to change. The hotel was supposed to be his biggest order of the year, a massive batch of handcrafted tables and shelving for a boutique chain expanding to the West Coast. The deposit alone had kept the workshop afloat. If they backed out now, if they yanked the contract. Van swiped to call the number. The voice on the other end sounded genuinely regretful, which almost made it worse. Nothing personal, man. They just decided to go with a mass production model instead. Budget cuts or some corporate nonsense. Van clenched his jaw. And what about the materials I already bought? The time I already put in? Yeah, the supplier said, hesitating. I know it's a tough break. Wish I had better news. Van hung up without another word, tossing his phone onto the bench. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind already spiraling through worst-case scenarios. He had barely dug himself out of the last financial hole. A loss like this? It could sink him completely. A throat cleared behind him. He turned to see Kala standing near the doorway, holding Ori against her hip, a deep crease between her brows. Bad news? She asked. He exhaled through his nose. Nothing you need to worry about. Kala shifted Ori to her other arm. You're actually going to try that? Like I don't live here? Like I'm not standing 10 feet away watching you silently lose your mind? Van braced his hands against the workbench, debating how much to say. It wasn't that he didn't want Kala to know, he just didn't see the point. She watched him carefully. Is this about the hotel order? His head snapped up. How do you know about that? She shrugged. I read things when you leave them out. Don't act shocked. Van let out a low, frustrated sigh, reaching for a rag and wiping the sweat from his hands. They pulled the order. Just corporate restructuring, nothing I can fight. Kala nodded slowly, processing. Okay, she said. Then we get a new order. Van let out a short laugh. Oh yeah? Just like that? Yeah, just like that. Van raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to say something absurd. And then she did. I'll sell the crib. Van blinked. What? The one we built, she said. I'll pitch it. He frowned. Pitch it to who? She tilted her chin up, eyes flashing with something Van had never seen before. My father's biggest competitor. Van stared at her, half convinced she was joking. You want to pitch a crib, he repeated. To one of the most cutthroat men in the business? Kala nodded. Why not? Because that's, he paused, rubbing a hand over his jaw. That's insane. She smirked. So is letting the workshop go under without a fight. Van let out a breath, studying her. She wasn't wrong. But this was Kala. The woman who had never hustled for anything in her life, who had once called customer service on a $10,000 handbag because the shade of blue wasn't exactly right. Do you even know how to pitch? He asked. Kala grinned. Watch me. The meeting was at a high-end corporate office in Midtown, the kind of place Kala had spent years rolling her eyes at but also secretly loving. She walked in wearing the only blazer she owned, a structured black thing she had bought on a whim before realizing it was wildly impractical for her lifestyle. It was perfect for this moment. She barely recognized herself. She held her head high, striding through the glass doors of Hawthorne Luxury Living, a brand known for cutting into her father's profit margins every chance it got. She had one shot at this. Mr. Hawthorne himself sat across from her, a bored-looking man in a suit so expensive it could have paid off her credit card debt twice over. Miss Whitmore, he said, his tone both amused and skeptical. I was surprised to see your name on the schedule. What can I do for you? Kala placed her perfectly organized pitch folder on the table. I have a crib to sell you. Hawthorne actually looked intrigued. A crib? Kala nodded. Handmade, high-quality materials, customizable finishes. The kind of thing your buyers would fight over. He leaned back. And why wouldn't I just continue sourcing cribs from Italy, like I always do? Kala didn't miss a beat. Because my father doesn't have this design. And because your customers will love the exclusivity. Hawthorne's bored expression shifted. He flipped through the sketches, tapping his fingers against the table. Kala kept her face neutral, but inside, her pulse was hammering. Finally, he sat back. I'll take a small test run. Let's start with 50 units. Kala exhaled so subtly it was barely noticeable. Done, she said. The contract was signed within the hour. By the time Kala walked out of the building, her hands were shaking. She had actually done it. Back at the workshop, Van was waiting by the door, arms crossed, clearly expecting bad news. Kala handed him the contract. He read it once. Then twice. Then a third time. He looked up, completely stunned. You actually did it, he said. Calla smirked. Told you to watch me. Van shook his head, something new in his expression. Respect. Maybe even something more. Graham never showed up unannounced. He was the kind of man who made an entrance, never an appearance, always ensuring people had time to anticipate, adjust, prepare. So when Calla opened the workshop door to find him standing there, immaculate in his tailored suit, unimpressed by the smell of sawdust, looking like he had just stepped out of a private jet and into a place he had no business being, she knew something was wrong. She held the doorframe, instinctively shielding Ori, who was balanced on her hip. You're supposed to call first. Graham didn't even glance at the baby. We need to talk. Calla exhaled sharply. If this is about the crib order, I already know you're furious. You can send your official statement of disappointment via email. His expression didn't change. This isn't about business. She went still. That was worse. Graham stepped inside, barely masking his distaste for everything around him, the dust on the floor, the half-finished furniture stacked against the walls, the obvious lack of control he had in this space. Van, sitting at the workbench, glanced up, eyes assessing, calm, but alert. Graham ignored him completely. Calla squared her shoulders. Whatever you came to say it. Graham adjusted his cufflinks. You've had your fun. Calla blinked. Excuse me? This little rebellion, he continued, voice even, unwavering. It's run its course. It's time to come home. Calla's grip on Ori tightened. Graham tilted his head slightly, taking her in like she was a problem he had already solved. You've proven your point, he said. You wanted to be independent, and you did your best. But this, he gestured vaguely around the room. This isn't sustainable. I can take care of Ori. You can have your life back. Calla felt it before she even processed it, the sharp, visceral reaction, the instinct to pull away, to protect, to fight. She laughed, but it wasn't light or amused. You're unbelievable. Graham barely blinked. You're exhausted. You don't have to do this alone. I'm not alone. Graham's gaze flickered, just slightly, toward Van, still silent in the background. Calla took a step forward. You think I'm going to hand over my daughter so I can go back to playing rich girl in the city? Is that what you think this was? His voice did not waver. I think you'll come to your senses. Calla set Ori down in the crib and turned fully to face him, pulse pounding. This is my life, she said, voice steady and sharp. This is my choice. And you don't get to take that away from me. Graham watched her for a moment, his silence heavier than his words ever were. Then, with a small, infuriatingly knowing nod, he turned to leave. Calla didn't look away until he was gone. Van let out a slow breath. That was intense. Calla rolled her shoulders, shaking off the weight of it. Yeah, she muttered. But it's over. And for the first time in her life, she had chosen something real. The first sign of trouble came when Van's suppliers stopped returning his calls. At first, he thought it was bad luck, maybe a mix-up in scheduling. Then came the emails, polite, regretful, all variations of the same thing. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we'll no longer be able to fulfill your order. Best of luck. By the time the third supplier backed out, Van knew exactly what was happening. He set his phone down on the workbench, exhaling through his nose. Your father's screwing with me. Calla, sitting on a stool with Ori balanced on her lap, frowned. What? Van crossed his arms, rolling his shoulders like he was physically preparing for a fight. He's cutting off my supply chain. He wants me to go under. Calla blinked, processing. Then, just as quickly, she rolled her eyes. That is so on brand for him. Van stared. That's your reaction? Well, yeah. This is exactly what he does. When people don't fall in line, he applies pressure until they crack. Van let out a short, humorless laugh. Great. And what do you suggest? Because I kind of need wood to run a woodworking business. Calla bounced Ori slightly, thinking. He's doing this to get to me. Van scoffed. Obviously. Which means he thinks I'll cave, she continued, ignoring his tone. That I'll see you struggling and come crawling back to fix it. Van turned to face her fully. And will you? Calla gave him a look so sharp it could cut glass. Not a chance in hell. Van felt something settle in his chest, something steady and unexpected. She meant it. He ran a hand through his hair. Well, unless you secretly have a warehouse of lumber hidden somewhere, I don't see how we fix this. Calla tilted her head, considering. Then, her expression shifted. Van recognized that look. That was the same expression she'd had when she sold the crib order, the one that meant she had an idea and he should be afraid. She reached for her phone. Van narrowed his eyes. What are you doing? Calla didn't answer. She was already scrolling through contacts, fingers flying over the screen. 30 minutes later, she set the phone down, looking entirely too satisfied with herself. Problem solved, she said. Van raised an eyebrow. I find that hard to believe. Calla smirked. I got you a new supplier. Van stared. Who? An old friend. Well, former friend. But I have leverage, so it evens out. Van crossed his arms. Calla. She waved a hand. Relax. I know what I'm doing. The contract's being finalized, and they're offering better pricing than any of the suppliers my father just bullied into dropping you. Van opened his mouth, closed it, then let out a slow breath. You're infuriatingly good at this. Calla grinned. I know. The next morning, the new contract arrived. By noon, the first shipment was already in transit. Graham had tried to cut them off at the knees. Instead, Calla had made them stronger. And Van, watching her run circles around the most powerful man in the city, finally understood something. Calla Whitmore was unstoppable. The workshop had changed. It wasn't something Van could pinpoint exactly. It wasn't the fresh stack of wood by the door or the half-finished crib designs lining the workbench. It wasn't even the way Ori's presence had become as natural as the sawdust in the air. It was something else, something quieter. Calla was still Calla, but she wasn't just passing through anymore. She moved through the space like it belonged to her, like she had a stake in it. She still complained about the dust, still rolled her eyes at Van's terrible coffee, but now she had favorite tools, favorite tasks. She argued about finishes and pricing, fought him on business decisions, and actually won sometimes. One afternoon, she walked in carrying a clipboard of all things, reading off a list. Okay, so we need to finalize the next order by Tuesday, and... Van looked up from his work. Are you actually managing my schedule? She waved a hand. Well, someone has to. Van smirked. You realize this means you're officially part of the business, right? Calla paused, like the thought had just registered. Then, to Van's complete surprise, she smiled. I guess I am, she said. The words settled between them, heavy but right. Later that evening, after Ori was asleep and the shop was quiet, Calla was sitting at the workbench, flipping through old sketches. She tapped a page. Hey. Van glanced up. Calla hesitated, then took a breath. Let's renew our vows. Van froze. She kept her gaze steady. Not because of my father. Not because of the contract. Because I want to. Van set his tools down slowly, turning to face her fully. You sure? Calla nodded. I'm sure. Something shifted. Something solid and undeniable. Van exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, he said. Let's do it. Calla smiled. And just like that, they weren't just surviving together anymore. They were choosing this life. The morning of the vow renewal was perfect in the unfussy, unplanned way that things had been lately. The sun filtered through the workshop windows, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floors. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of freshly cut cedar from the yard. Ori was babbling nonsense to her stuffed rabbit, completely uninterested in the fact that her parents were about to get married. Again. Calla stood in front of the tiny mirror nailed to the wall, adjusting the white sundress she had found in the back of the closet. It wasn't wedding dress white, more of a soft cream, and it had exactly 0 embellishments, but it was comfortable, and that mattered more now than it used to. Her belly was rounder than she liked to admit, the second baby making its presence known in ways she couldn't ignore, but Van had looked at her like she was the best thing he'd ever seen when she walked out of the bathroom, so she figured it would do. Van was already waiting near the workbench, hands in his pockets, a quiet steadiness about him. He had put on a button-down, no tie, no jacket, just simple on him, and Calla didn't realize how much she loved that about him until this exact moment. She stepped toward him, barefoot, because wearing heels in a woodworking shop seemed like a terrible idea, and took his outstretched hands. There was no officiant, no audience, no scripted vows. Just them. Van cleared his throat. So, how do you want to do this? Calla smiled. I say we just say what we mean. He nodded, thumb tracing circles over her palm, thinking. Then, in that calm, sure way of his, he spoke. I want this. Not because we had to, not because of anything that came before. Just because I want you. Calla's throat tightened. She blinked up at him, her heart annoyingly soft. I want this too, she said. I choose you, Van Calloway. And I don't do things I don't want to do. Van huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head like she was the most impossible thing in the world. Good, he murmured, pulling her closer. They kissed, and Ori, sensing that something important had happened but not entirely sure what, clapped enthusiastically from the floor. Calla turned, grinning. See? Even Ori approves. Van shook his head, picking up their daughter with ease. Yeah. You're very supportive, kiddo. Calla placed a hand on her belly, feeling a sharp cramp ripple through her. She frowned. Then another cramp, sharper this time. Van caught the change in her expression immediately. What's wrong? Calla opened her mouth, then sucked in a sharp breath. I think I'm in labor. Van stared at her, then at Ori, then back at her belly. You're joking, he said. Calla grabbed his arm, digging her nails into his sleeve as another contraction hit. Do I look like I'm joking? Van blinked. Right. Okay. Let's go. And just like that, their small, quiet vow renewal turned into a mad dash to the hospital. The drive to the hospital was chaos, though not the fun, rom-com kind of chaos. This was real, actual, terrifying chaos. Calla clenched her jaw through another contraction, gripping the car door so tightly her fingers went numb. I swear, Van, if you hit one more pothole. I'm literally avoiding them, he shot back, knuckles white on the steering wheel. You're aiming for them, she growled. Yeah, because what I really want right now is to get into an argument while you're actively having contractions. Ori, strapped into her car seat in the back, chose that exact moment to giggle, like this was all one big, hilarious game. Calla let out a shaky breath, not sure whether to laugh or cry. At least someone's enjoying themselves. Van took a turn too sharply, muttering under his breath. Calla squeezed her eyes shut as another wave of pain ripped through her. She had been through this before, she knew what labor felt like, but this was different. Sharper. Deeper. Harder. Van glanced over. Hey. You okay? She glared at him with every ounce of rage she could summon. I am literally trying to push a human out of my body. What do you think? Right. Dumb question. By the time they made it to the hospital, Calla was out of patience, out of breath, and dangerously close to breaking Van's fingers just for existing. The nurses rushed her into a delivery room, and everything blurred into a mess of beeping monitors, rushed voices, and the overwhelming sensation that this was going to be harder than before. She was exhausted before it even really started. Van hovered at her side, his usual calm, steady demeanor starting to fray at the edges. He wasn't the kind of man to panic, but she could tell he was one contraction away from losing it entirely. Okay, she gasped, sweat dampening her hairline. This baby is fired. I quit. We're done. Van tightened his grip on her hand, his voice low and sure. You're not quitting. She shot him a murderous look. I hate you. You don't. Okay, but I hate this. That's fair. She gritted her teeth through another contraction, pain radiating through every inch of her body. The doctor's voice cut through the haze. Baby's in a tough position. We're going to need you to push harder than last time, Calla. Calla let out something between a laugh and a sob. Harder? Are you kidding me? Van leaned in, his lips near her forehead, his voice steady even when everything else was chaos. You can do this. Her fingers dug into his arm, probably bruising him beyond repair, but he didn't pull away. Time lost meaning. It was just pain, just pressure, just a blur of effort and exhaustion. Then, suddenly, a cry. Loud. Strong. Real. Calla collapsed back against the pillows, her breath shaking, her body spent, her heart racing faster than she could control. And then, a tiny, warm weight was placed against her chest. She looked down and saw him. Their son. Perfect. Whole. Alive. Van let out a breath, one he had probably been holding the entire time, and reached out, his hands settling gently on the baby's back. Calla swallowed the lump in her throat, her fingers tracing over his impossibly small face, his tiny fists curled near his chest. Hey, little guy, she whispered, voice raw, thick with something too big to name. Van's hand tightened over hers, and when she looked up, she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Something that looked a lot like home. Graham Whitmore had always believed in control. He built his empire on it, carved his success out of sheer discipline and precision, never allowing emotion to interfere with logic. The world didn't reward softness. He had learned that lesson early, and he had spent years ensuring his daughter learned it, too. Except now, watching her from the quiet comfort of his car, he realized she never had. Calla stood outside the workshop, laughing at something Van had said, her hair piled into a messy bun, a streak of sawdust smudged across her cheek. She looked different here, not the carefully curated version of herself he had spent years refining. There was no designer dress, no polished performance, no air of bored disinterest. She was just living. Graham watched as Ori toddled over, her tiny hands reaching for Calla's leg. Without hesitation, Calla scooped her up, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before settling her on her hip. Van appeared a moment later, carrying a stack of wood, their newborn son strapped securely to his chest in one of those ridiculous baby wraps Graham had never understood. Calla said something, smirking, and Van rolled his eyes before leaning in to kiss her, quick and familiar. Graham's stomach tightened. He hadn't come here to spy, not exactly. He had told himself he was just checking in, just confirming that she was really okay. But now, watching them, something unexpected settled in his chest. She was okay. She wasn't drowning without his help, wasn't struggling, wasn't asking for anything. She had built something real. The realization was uncomfortable, unfamiliar. For so long, he had convinced himself that she needed him, that without his influence, his control, she would fail. And yet, here she was. Whole. Happy. Strong. He let out a slow breath, adjusting his cufflinks out of habit. Then, without saying a word, without making his presence known, he drove away.